So thank you again. I don't have any announcement to make, so I feel a bit pointless being here. So I'll just start on the panel. Our last panel is on sex work mental health, except we said we would not say mental health, we would call it psychosocial health. We know that is an extremely important topic for our community, and we're glad to have a whole panel who will discuss different aspects related to this topic. I'll just let you start directly, and you can come here and present and introduce yourself. Do you want water here, maybe? All right, cool. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. I hope you're all feeling lovely and full, and probably a bit sleepy. So, myself, I am Countess Diamond. That's my working name, and the name I go by in kind of places like this is Harper. Neither of those are my real names. And this is quite unusual for me to be this dressed on live stream. Normally, I'm presenting and doing things in latex and lingerie, and I work primarily online. And I'm here today with my very good friend and research colleague, Josie West, to talk about data violence against online workers and how that has an impact on what we're now calling psychosocial health, so mental health and well-being in the online workspace. We're going to cover revenge porn, institutionalized stigma, and then potentially a solution to the problems that online workers face. So what is data violence? It sounds quite scary, quite dramatic, and the way that it comes across in online spaces is the symbolic violences extracted by data technologies. So anytime your data has been used against you, or you have been marginalized or put into a siphon, that is how you are being victimized by your data. And what does it have to do with mental health and well-being of the sex work sector? It has everything to do with it. So from being here today and yesterday, I've realized that I actually feel like a slight amount of shame because I'm an online sex worker and I'm really proud to stand up and say I'm a sex worker. But I've never actually provided a full service full sex, and I feel like, oh my gosh, why am I entitled to say that I face this fear and stigma? And it's quite a struggle for me, but I know that by standing up and saying, yeah, I entertain people in a sexual manner, I believe I'm a sex worker, and I can use my privilege and my platform and my TikTok followers to stand up and fight for the rights of everybody in the sex industry. So what does this have to do, this online world, this porn we view, what does it have to do with mental health? It has an awful lot. So safety, autonomy, income, it all impacts the way we live our lives, the way we're seen on the internet and in the wider society, and therefore has impact on the working conditions and health of workers in this sector. So my personal experience of data violence, I have experienced my content being stolen, reproduced, banking services have been terminated, I have been questioned at borders, I have had my content screen recorded and shared without consent, online payment processors terminated multiple times, and I have been unable to get banking services. And these aren't unique experiences. I have been doxxed and stalked by uploaded ID. I've had my personal images linked to my work images without my consent. I have been shadow banned, if not permanently banned, and deplatformed due to banking terminations. At one point, I had 2 weeks to reroute my entire income from one platform to another. And I was 8 months pregnant. Data violence in numbers. So how does this affect the people that you communicate with in the wider world of sex work? So when asked which elements of data violence they had been subjected to, a survey showed that of 96% of full-service online workers in the Sex Workers Union in the UK, 80% of respondents had been the victim of image-based violence, 76% of respondents had experienced payment issues, 60% of respondents had been the victim of content theft or piracy, And 40% of the respondents stated that they have been victims of doxing. Now, that's almost half of the sex workers in the Sex Workers Union have been victims of doxing. And doxing can be a life-threatening, life-limiting situation. This is violence against sex workers in the broadest of terms. A 2023 survey of UK sex workers showed that 96% of full-service respondents, so that is as many respondents who work indoors or on the street, 96% of those at some point in their career are online. So whether that's advertising their full-service work or earning a little bit of cash through selling feet pics, whatever stage of the process, the parts of this industry, 96% of the people in the union were affected by online regulation. So I'm here to present to you the problem, and I have spoken with my colleague Josie, who has become a wonderful, fantastic friend. We've only actually just met this week. We have been talking for quite some time, and we've only just met. It's really cool. So what is the solution? I've come with a problem, and I've tried to communicate across what is the solution. I believe that ethical trade, ensuring fair prices, fair labor conditions, and transparent practices in online spaces is essential to maintaining a safe workspace. Now, this sounds like regulation, and indeed it kind of is, but we are already regulated online, so why not make these regulations work in our favor? What does this have to do with safety and health in sex work? By implementing fair trade practices, and I want you to consider fair trade chocolate, fair trade coffee, where the workers get a minimum wage, where they get what they deserve and they get safe working conditions, the sex industry can work towards mitigating harm, improving working conditions, and overall destigmatization of the industry. And if 96% of UK sex workers have been affected by this, that's an awful lot of people. And I also want you to consider the amount of people who consume the content that these people create in terms of a digital product. You yourself have watched porn, I'm sure of it. Wouldn't it be incredible to say that the porn that you consumed, however violent, however graphic, however unusual and strange, was absolutely recorded in the fairest, above-board manner, and you can guarantee that? Anyway, that's the problem and a possible solution, and I will pass over to Josie.
Thank you, Diamond. So yeah, it might seem like a bit of a pie-in-the-sky idea, but it's existed for a while now among sex workers and grassroots activists. And if you look at the kind of what fair trade did for farming, we can see that it established clear ethical standards and did this through a co-op. So workers' cooperatives are democratically owned, they're owned by the workers, and there's obviously better divestment of profits. You also have to have transparent supply chains, so we're thinking about building a platform that can't be vulnerable to sex trafficking perpetrators. So then also we can stop this conversation that's not differentiating between consensual sex workers and non-consensual sex workers from happening online, which is currently really problematic. And also you would have to have a fair trade certifying organisation for sex workers. So we'd want this to be sex worker-led, and these would be people who are monitoring the standards of online sex work platforms and ensuring that they're adhering to certain standards. And then we can also apply this to labour context globally. This doesn't just have to be in the UK where me and Diamond are working. So just like going into this a little bit deeper, so what are these kind of conditions that we're talking about? So we want a minimum price set for wages. We want a minimum price set for products, like for camming, that would be like photos and video content. And obviously, we're all here talking about work and the improvement of labour standards in the sex work sector, and this could seriously promote health and well-being standards. We could even build this into the platform, so we could have specific areas around mental health and resources around mental health. I found generally in my research that these kind of capitalist-owned platforms are not generally concerned with the well-being of their workers. What they're concerned with is profits and ensuring they abide by regulations or getting workers to work as much as possible through their kind of coercive algorithm systems. We can also have anti-exploitation measures built in, so anti-screen recording software. We need super tight, watertight online identity protection going on as well, obviously, because it's a huge concern for sex workers. And how do we know how these capitalist platforms are storing your data? That's obviously a key concern. And also building end-to-end encryption into the product of labour. So when someone sells some content, if someone steals that and posts it elsewhere, we'll know where it came from. And yeah, we want to focus on improving consumers' ideas of sex workers. So really thinking about getting them to think about making an ethical choice when they consume porn and sex work in general, and not putting their money into these more exploitative platforms that aren't really thinking about labour rights in general. I think that's really important. So, like when you go to a supermarket and you see a fair trade banana and you see a normal banana, you do have to make a kind of ethical choice in your head. So I want to talk a little bit about fair trade porn in academia. So this idea did arise from the grassroots. There's someone called Tristan Taormino, who's a feminist porn producer. I don't know if you guys have probably heard of her. And they basically started talking about fair trade porn with reference to their work in feminist pornography, and how they started producing porn where there was conversations around consent with regards to different practices, and also creating porn for the female, not just the male gaze, but centering female pleasure and that kind of thing. So she was one of the first people I can find that talks about fair trade porn. And then Heather Berg talks about feminists, how these spaces within porn is drawing important attention to notions of worker control, which I think is really critical, not just within sex work, but within labour rights in general. There needs to be worker control. And back in 2008, we had someone called Aston talking about the ethical consumer, and she was actually referring to female consumers of sex work who go abroad and buy sex. And she was kind of challenging the idea that all consumers of sex are kind of seedy, gross people, when actually you can be an ethical consumer of sex. And then finally we have Wilkinson talking about these discourses of fair trade, ethical and socially responsible porn, and talking about how they're imagining kind of these alternative economic structures, which I think is really important in this context. My field of interest is digital political economy, and I'm thinking about how capitalism could be changed. And I think sex workers are really at the forefront of that sort of resistance to the standard employment model, and wanting more autonomous work and that kind of thing. So I think there's some exciting possibilities there. So I want to quickly talk about power and disempowerment. So I know that the language of empowerment can be complicated in this work, because people can feel like, why do we have to be empowered by our work? Why is there always this discourse? But we can see that Foster-Sester, the bill from America, has been extremely disempowering for sex workers, removing the ability to advertise online, not differentiating between consensual and non-consensual sex workers, has been hugely impactful across the whole world, not just within the American context where sex work is really, really criminalized. And then just recently in the UK, we have had the Online Safety Act, which is all about reducing online harms for children and for trafficking victims and that kind of thing. But it really hasn't at all taken into consideration consensual sex workers. There's no discourse whatsoever within the Act about protecting all forms of sex work as vulnerable to harm, which is really, really problematic. And so this is going to lead to greater punitive approaches to online advertising, even more than there is already. yeah, just today you said that you got locked out of Google, didn't you? Yeah, just today Diamond was locked out of her Google Drive account. You also said that some WhatsApp groups are being shut down already in the UK. So already we can see these, what the government is essentially trying to do is make platforms accountable for sex work, advertising of sex work and trafficking, but it's having a really harmful effect. But there is hope to be found. So I use a workerist theorist called Mario Tronti. He's a Marxist. He was writing in the 60s and 70s and was organizing, a big part of like the organizing in factories at the time. And he says that technology can be repurposed to sabotage capital. And I think this is a really important idea in the context of the gig economy, which camming is part of. Because although these gig economy platforms can be quite extractive and exploitative, they're also giving the means of production potentially to workers themselves. So it is actually possible with this new technology. You know, like workers own the computers, they own the cameras and the ring lights and all of that. They could also potentially earn the platforms instead of them being capitalist owned. And this idea has emerged from someone called Trevor Scholes. He's doing a lot of work on this in New York. And he's been part of a big movement of platform cooperatives in the gig economy. So places like Uber and those kind of apps like delivery, like food service delivery platforms are being platformized. So the workers are essentially owning them. So it's marrying the kind of gig economy technology with the notion of worker ownership and power. And myself and Diamond, I'm currently applying for some funding to try and get this kick-started, and it will be primarily worker-led and worker-owned, completely worker-owned. So it is complicated. There are some arguments against it. Are we going to be able to compete against venture capitalist-backed platforms, which have a lot more power? But we think by kind of building in these fair trade principles, we're potentially forcing consumers to make an ethical choice, which might, it's still very preliminary. We haven't started it yet, but hopefully it could bring about some change. And there's someone called Mark Graham at Oxford University in the UK that's actually doing some really cool research in this area. I don't know if you guys have heard of the Fair Work Foundation, but they are they've created a set of 5 principles for fair work, and they're going, this is like a completely transnational movement of like workers, academics, lawyers, and they're going around and basically being this kind of certifying organization like there was in fair trade, and they are giving these gig economy platforms a fair work valuation, basically, and they've only just started thinking about online sex work. So we have quite a big base to build on if we do get the funding for our platform cooperative. So there's some exciting movements going in this direction. So yeah, I just wanted to touch quickly on the differences between workers and academics, and I'm really grateful for the people today who spoke about co-research and ethical practices. It's really helpful for me to think about. And I think we have to really think about what spheres we're operating in and how we can separately contribute to this movement. Workers are obviously in the grassroots. You guys are doing the most work here. You guys are the experts of sex workers' rights. You can also obviously unionize and lobby government, as many of you are doing. And particularly within camming, being a multi-billion-dollar sector, you can also cause disruption within production. So that is a powerful thing. And there was a big OnlyFans resistance when they threatened to kick sex workers out, and they immediately, within like 4 days, did a massive U-turn after loads of Twitter protesting and stuff. So yeah, this is a industry that has a lot of power if they do organize. And then academics can draw on expertise in terms of online sex work within technology, so how to build the software of these platforms fairly, how can we rebuild algorithms in the interests of workers rather than in the interests of the capitalists, and also labor rights. And we can also, like, this conference is so cool. I really, really appreciate what you're doing here. Encourage as much collaboration as possible. We also, I think, need to get sex workers writing as much, so it's not just us writing for them or in their interests, it's also them co-collaborating, authoring papers. We could even potentially think about writing something together out of this conference. And we can also make policy recommendations, as can you guys. So I think we need to think, this is like a very basic outline, but I think we need to think about where we're different and how we can align and how we can do the same thing to help the movement in general. So thank you.